Hi everyone. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about how we collect data. Now, we're going to be talking about three different methods of data collection. We'll talk about structured observations first, um, and then surveys and self-reports next. Now, um, in my mind, when most people think about research with people, oftentimes what they're thinking about is survey research, and we will talk about that today. But in survey research, what you're doing is you're giving people a stack of measures or questionnaires, assessments, or whatever, and you ask them to fill it out and then give it back to you. There were times when we did this through mail, and of course now we can do it over the internet or through email or something like that. Um, but and like I said, that's probably what comes to mind when most people think about research with people. They think about um, some kind of survey research, and that's a great way of collecting data if that's what the question is really asking about. But we're going to start here talking about what's called structured observation, and this is another good way to collect data. Again, sort of depending on what the question is. So to give you an example here of what a structured observation might be, in in a clinical context, you might have a social worker in a school who goes into a classroom to observe a student that a teacher is concerned about. Maybe there's behavior problems or acting out or something like that. So the social worker goes into the classroom, maybe sits in the back, kind of unobtrusively, and takes notes. That's a good sort of clinical example of a structured observation. In research, sort of on the research side of things, we might do observations when we're coding psychotherapy sessions. So sometimes we're looking for, how many times, a clinician redirects or asks a client to practice a certain skill or something like that. And so you might have someone watching from behind a one-way mirror. More than likely you'd have someone watching a recording of a session and sort of counting or checking off the number of times the um, the behavior in question or the content in question sort of comes up. So that's kind of what an observation would look like. And they of course do it with um, studies of kids. Sometimes they watch how they play. They watch how they interact with a toy or a piece of technology or something like that. But we use them in both sort of case level and group level designs. And so oftentimes what you're looking for is either the interval of a certain behavior, the frequency of a certain behavior, or the duration of a certain behavior. So the interval would be sort of and let me back up. So what it is you're recording, whether you record the interval, the frequency, or the duration, it sort of depends on what it is you're asking about. So the interval, typically you're recording the number of times or the amount of time in between certain behaviors. Frequency would be the number of times a certain behavior occurs, and then duration would be the length of time that behavior occurs. And there's lots of situations where maybe you're recording all three of them. Of course, what you really need, and so what the slide means by reliability here, what you really need is a good sort of operational definition of what the behavior is. So years ago, I coded some data from it was in a classroom, and we were looking at the number of times the student uh, sort of got out of his seat. Well, as you can imagine, there are sort of instances of getting out of the seat where it's very clear that that's getting out of the seat. But what about sort of adjusting or switching positions or something like that? Does that count as out of seat behavior? Um, in some other portion of the study, they were looking at swearing, and so it was very clear. Certain words. Certainly it was very clear that they counted as swear words, but There were other there were other words that we didn't know, right? We didn't know if it was if that was considered a swear word or not. So we had to have sort of this big conversation about what's the what's the cutoff for problematic language versus sort of non-problematic language. At any rate, as long as you clarify these things beforehand, the coding piece of this can actually be really fun. So interval is the amount of time in between behaviors. Frequency is the number of times it occurs. Duration is the length of time it lasts. So maybe you're looking for for time on task or something like that. That might be a good way to think about interval. If you're thinking about um, you know uh, uh, out of seat behavior or something like that, that might be frequency. And if you were thinking about, say, how long that out of seat behavior lasts or something like that, that would be a good example of duration. So magnitude would be the severity of the of the behavior. So is it just one swear word or 100 swear words or something like that? If I use the example in a spot check, you're checking intermittently, and then in permanent product recording, you have a video camera or something like that, and you can actually record the um, the episodes of concern, or the you can actually record the observations and have multiple people sort of review it. Um, Another way to do sort of a live action spot check would be, um, your a social worker checks a classroom periodically, maybe at random every hour or something like that, just to check on a student or something like that. Again, depends on what it is the research question is. So who's doing the observing is actually kind of an important question, because we know from sort of our discussions about the Hawthorne effect and things like that, that when people know they're being watched, they change their behavior. So um, is the person an outside observer, or are they completely indigenous? And if they're indigenous, that means they blend in, and the person, or the people being observed are unlikely to know that they're actually sort of being observed. In the school example I gave, that would actually be really hard to do. It would be really hard to find an indigenous observer, because it's not as though you could have a student, counting or watching the behavior of another student. I mean, I suppose you could, but that might not be ethical. And of course, if the social worker were to come in, all of the students would sort of be alerted to that person's presence, and probably change their behavior. So, so that's sort of how you would think about selecting an observer. There certainly are times when an indigenous observer just isn't available. I suppose if you were doing something in a classroom, what you would want is the teacher herself or himself to do it, so that maybe they can sort of surreptitiously record problem behavior or something like that, so that the student isn't alerted to what it is they're doing. All right, interviewing. So interviewing is typically when people get together face to face. We ask um, typically long, open-ended questions, um, and record either through video or notes or both people's responses to our questions. Just lots of advantages of research interviewing. And let me put myself up here for a second. So there's a certain organicness and genuineness, naturalness, spontaneity. You tend to get good response rates because you set up an appointment with someone. Like, hey, can we get together Friday at 3 o'clock or something like that? It's very flexible. You get as the interview, you get access to lots of information, like nonverbal information, and you of course get access to sort of serendipitous information, things that people remember all of a sudden, that they might not necessarily remember in a survey. And then of course there's lots of control over the environment, because in a good interviewer will travel to the interviewees, location of choice, if that's what the interviewee is interested in. Of course, ethics, confidentiality, things like that are all something to be, uh, uh, something you have to think through. I've done a number of interviews in sort of coffee shops and restaurants and things like that. Of course, that was when we weren't necessarily interviewing about sensitive information. We were just interested in very sort of mundane kinds of things. But I've also certainly done interviews in offices and people's homes where we were asking about much more sensitive kinds of information. Now, there's typically two ways you conduct interviews. You can do them one-on-one, and that's very useful. You can also do them sort of in a group form. And group is nice, except that it's really hard to coordinate schedules. And you might get someone who sort of dominates the conversation, wants to talk a lot, intimidates other people. But on the other hand, sometimes it's nice to have lots of people because a sense of community develops, and someone says something that reminds someone else of something, and they say, oh, hey, I have something to add. So you get that sort of spontaneity and kind of that organic nature. But there are some disadvantages of research interviewing. It's expensive. It takes a lot of time. You're paying typically mileage and time for the interviewer. You're typically paying, if the interviewee is coming to you, you're typically reimbursing them for time and money. A lot of people are uninterested, so they're sort of inaccessible. Some people have started interviews and they decide that they just don't like them, they want to end them. And then, of course, if you're interviewing in groups, there's a real loss of anonymity, and a real threat to sort of, breaches of confidentiality and things like that. And then, of course, there is, kind of interviewer influence and that Hawthorne effect that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. I once was doing a focus group with a group of veterans, and I had disclosed that I'm not a veteran, but my co-facilitator was actually a veteran. He's a Vietnam veteran, and at the end, as people started to fatigue, it sort of so we'd interviewed folks for about 90 minutes, and at the end, as people started to fatigue, they started sharing stories about about their experiences in the military, and the co-facilitator sort of lapsed into that role as well, and sort of forgot that he was sort of on the outside, that he was the interviewer. So we had to sort of deal with that after the fact, which we did. There were no breaches in confidentiality or ethics or anything like that. We just weren't able to ask all of the questions that we had hoped. And again, part of that was because we spent about 90 minutes going through these questions, and people just fatigued. They were ready to move on to something else, which was totally fine. So there's typically a structured, a level of structure to the interviews. If they're structured, semi-structured, or completely unstructured. So if they're structured, there's a sort of a set list of questions, and nothing else is really asked. If they're unstructured, there's sort of no questions, maybe one to get the kind of interview started. Most research interviews are sort of semi-structured, so people have questions, and then they're allowed to ask probes. They're allowed to use probes or prompts, and they typically would use probes and prompts to get more information. So you would say things like that, like, "Oh, tell me more," or "Can you say more about X, whatever it is you just said." So that's a good example of kind of a semi-structured interview, and I think that's where a lot of research interviews fall, because it gives a certain degree of flexibility to get more information out of participants, but it's not so rigid or sort of free form as to be completely unstructured. Um, it's important to think about sort of the sequencing of questions. We typically want to build rapport with people, so we ask easy questions first. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about your experience with whatever, you know, whatever it is the research topic is. Um, Reviewing the rules or the guidelines, that kind of thing. So sequencing is typically pretty important. And then there's a difference between sort of open-ended and closed-ended ended questions. Um, Good interviewers will use lots of open-ended questions, and open-ended questions are simply questions that have kind of an infinite, answer choice, or infinite number of answer choices. In a uh, closed-ended questions you typically would see on a survey, but you're giving the research participant um, a set number of answers from which they choose. So in my mind, if you're going to do a survey, you're using closed-ended questions. But if you're going through the expense and the effort of meeting someone in person, why not just use open-ended questions, especially for things that aren't related to sort of demographics and things like that. Nevertheless, it is important that you know the difference between open and closed-ended questions. So in an open-ended question, there's sort of an infinite, number of answers. In a closed-ended question, the researcher is specifying a set of answers from which the participant can choose. I may ask on an exam, I may ask you to write a closed-ended question or an open-ended question or both. And if the question asks you to write a closed-ended question, make sure you specify those answer choices in your response. It is important to think about matching interviewer and interviewee characteristics. I mentioned some years ago I was part of a project that interviewed a group of veterans. So I was part of the interviews with male veterans, but I was not part of the interviews with female veterans. And we decided it was better to have women interviewers in the room with our group of women veterans. It's also important to think about gender, age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic level, that kind of thing. I've interviewed lots of people, and typically they've gone very well, but that's because we've been very thoughtful about how my presence would impact, or anyone's presence um, would impact someone's responses. The same thing applies in setting up interviews that does in sort of clinical practice. Give some thought to who should be closest to the door. Give some thought to how comfortable the space is, or uncomfortable the space is. Give some thought to how your presence makes the participant feel. So there's lots of ways to gain access to interviewees. You can put ads out. You can go through an organization. You can cold call people and write or send them emails and ask them to schedule an appointment to come into an office, or schedule a time for you to come visit them. But all of these things sort of require hoops to jump through in coordination. So you have to talk to an organization. If you're going through an organization, you have to then get participants' cooperation, establish legitimacy. Typically, have to verify credentials, and establish that you are in fact from a certain college or university. And most of the time, depending on what you want to ask about, people are willing to participate in interviews as long as it doesn't take forever and there is some kind of compensation for them, even if it's a small gift card or something like that. Most people, though, are willing to participate in the research that social workers are doing because they're altruistic. They want to, they want to contribute to the greater good. And then, of course, where is a big place. Offices, homes, neutral places. I've done interviews in parks before, in sort of public spaces. I've done lots of interviews in homes, in some very rural places, and some very impoverished places. Um, some some I've gone into some homes that um, that you know there was reason to be concerned. So you also have to think about sort of what you're asking, the person who's doing the interviewing to do as well. I went to one home that it had very large dogs. There were a lot of them, and I don't have a particular fear of dogs. And these dogs were probably more noisy than they were, than they were aggressive. But my clothes were covered in sort of drool and slobber and hair and things like that. The dogs were not particularly well behaved, although, like I said, they were more noisy than they were, kind of aggressive. Um, and it was a very different experience. But it, this was sort of all the part of the important things that we had to do in order to get the information, that we wanted. This particular the person didn't have a means to travel from their residence to the location where we were, and the public transit bus service was horrendous in this particular area. So there was no way they were gonna be able to you know come to the location, where we were. So lots of things to think about when you're creating questions for interviews. Keep the language simple. Avoid double-barreled questions. So double-barreled questions ask about two things. So something like, are you worried about climate change and gun control? Right. That's a good example of it because it asked about two things. The way to fix double-barreled questions is simply to break it into two questions. So tell me what you think about climate change. It's one question. Tell me what you think about gun control. That's a second question. Double negatives. Let's see if I can come up with a good double negative real quick. Are you opposed to anti-gun legislation? Right. So opposed to anti-gun, right? That actually means, are you in favor of gun legislation, right? And it sort of requires people to do too many mental gymnastics to process the question. So double negative sort of goes well with keeping language simple. You never want to ask biased questions. So something like, you do support limits to immigration, don't you? Right? That's sort of inviting a particular response, and you certainly don't want to do that. And then you really want to, avoid interview bias. So it's really important that interviewers ask questions sort of neutrally and calmly, and it's important that they communicate that they understand the interviewer, but not so much so that they're inviting some kind of change in responses on the part of participants. So two ways to sort of record. You can handwrite notes. You can use audio recordings. Years ago, we used to use these little tape recorders. Then we moved to these little digital recorders, and then we moved to using recordings on our phones. I've had tapes not record. I've had batteries die. I've had these like digital recording devices malfunction. Phones typically are pretty reliable, but there's a concern, with a phone. It's like, oh well, what are you going to do with that? Is that going to leave your phone? And so as long as you're very clear about how you transfer the data and keep it secure, participants are usually fine with something like that. All right, so let's go on to survey research. And again, like I said a couple of minutes ago, I think most of the time when people think about social research or research with people, they're thinking about survey research. So opinion polls, political polls, these are really good examples of survey research. And survey research it's quick. It's not as expensive as some of the other kinds of data collection. You can get large sample sizes very quickly. So there's some degree of generalizability, and then it's also very versatile. You can adapt it sort of into lots of different forms. So um, when I say versatile, one of the examples that comes to mind is um, people who are doing in-person interviews or structured observations when COVID hit, probably were not able to continue to collect data. They probably had to stop. On the other hand, people who are doing survey research probably were able to continue, especially if they were, sending their questions or their assessments out by email, or using SurveyMonkey or some kind of online platform, um, to continue to collect data. So it's very versatile. Um, One of the disadvantages, though, is that you don't necessarily build the rapport that you do when you're in person. So that's one of the trade-offs. But again, it really sort of depends on the research question. So good surveys can accommodate both closed and open-ended questions. You do see many more closed-ended questions in survey research. And some of those same guidelines for writing questions still apply. No double-barreled questions. Keep your language simple. Um, no double negative questions. Then take into account culture and memory functions. So let me give you a couple of guidelines here. Um, um, so you want to, if you're going to use a Likert scale, and that's what this avoid either disagreement or agreement disagreeable. Um, Typically, you would use strongly disagree, disagree, agree, strongly agree. And so you don't want, you want, you don't want to make uh, agreeing with the question, um, meaning a response has to go with disagree. Again, the way to sort of avoid that is to go with very simple kinds of language. So here's an example, and again, I think if you're following the simple language guideline, you wouldn't fall into this particular trap. But if you asked a question, or if you gave a statement like, "Don't should politicians or politicians should take action to limit gun violence," or let's actually do it this way: politicians should not take action to limit gun violence. Well, if you agree with that, you're actually saying that politicians should do absolutely nothing, right? So again, it's a lot of mental gymnastics that people have to go through, and so keeping it simple is sort of the way to kind of avoid that pitfall. You want to sort of avoid appeals to social desirability. Social desirability is when people ask or respond to questions in a way that makes them appear good or more attractive or something like that. So people tend to minimize drinking. They tend to maximize income, or overrepresent income, that kind of thing. They tend to minimize, smoking behavior, drug use behavior, that kind of thing. Fence sitting is when there's lots of neutral options. I'm not a big proponent of using neutral, so I like to sort of only offer choices that are either positive or negative, no neutral, because then at least you're getting information about whether people are on the positive or negative side of the range of questions. Sensitive questions you can ask about, and sometimes the anonymity of a survey is useful for gaining the information that's particularly sensitive. But you don't want to ask too many sensitive questions. And then the format of the questions—that's what the slide means by single or multiple questions. That goes back to a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about different kinds of answer options in a closed-ended questions. A Likert scale is a special name for an ordinal variable. In a Likert scale, you typically have strongly disagree, disagree, agree, strongly agree. Sometimes there's a neutral. That would be a valid option in a Likert scale. And you can even break that out into, more, a finer range of options, like agree somewhat, agree quite a bit, agree very strongly or something like that. Again, you don't want to confuse people, you don't want to overwhelm them, but it sort of depends on the question. So if you're designing an instrument, what you may need to do for your capstone projects, you can adapt an existing instrument, but you do want to keep it focused. You don't want to ask in 20 questions information that you could get in 10. It's important to test your questions, to refine them, to get feedback from others, and then think about sort of the order of the questions, and sort of keep things looking attractive, and at least neat. Let's put it that way. So, a pleasing font, something that's not too dense. The writing, the font size isn't too small that people have to squint to be able to see what it is they're doing. If you do a matrix, you have sort of the same answer choices for a bunch of different questions, so people can go through very quickly and indicate their answers, because the answer choices are all the same for a couple of different questions. And then interpretive questions are asking what people think or how they feel or what their opinion is on a particular on that particular topic, and that's a good way to get lots of good information in addition to the kind of behavioral questions that we like to ask. So when you're thinking about surveys, which again you might need to do this for your capstone, think about how you're going to be administering them. Is it pencil and paper? Is it something that's online? Are you going to put things on a tablet and ask people to use their finger to indicate their answers, or is it going to be a combination of all of the above? So you have to think through how it looks in those on those different devices, and how it looks in paper. And then, of course, think about the cost to reproduce, the cost to put things online, so on and so forth. How you distribute the surveys is again, sort of depends a little bit on the population, what you're asking about. Some people do telephone surveys, and that was a really popular thing that people did in the 90s and the 2000s. These days, with email and social media, it's pretty easy to reach people through electronic means. But if you have the resources, phone surveys are actually really nice because they have typically very high response rates. And in some ways, phone surveys actually blend kind of interviews and surveys, because you're often asking survey type questions over the phone, so it's almost in an interview format. They are incredibly tedious though, because you have to read all of the answer choices, all of the questions, so they take a very, very long time. Again, that's where email, internet, social media distribution, that kind of thing has sort of picked up some of the slack and brought in some efficiency to the world of research. That's been really nice. There are researchers who have people come into their location, and then they give them a stack of papers, a stack of assessments to fill out, or they sit them down at a computer and show them how to work through the questions kind of online. And that's really nice to do because you typically get a really good response rate. Certainly adds a little bit of cost and a little bit of coordination, increases the level of coordination a little bit. But you typically get more rapport. You have a little bit higher response rate. Data are typically a little bit more. You have a little bit more control over the kind of data. So again, survey research is versatile. It's efficient. You can get large samples, so it can be very generalizable. And I wonder if I repeated these slides. I think maybe I did. But it does have some disadvantages as well, and that's that you don't necessarily build rapport, and you don't always have the time to ask those kind of interpretive questions that you might be able to ask in a true kind of interview. So, yep, I did repeat those slides. I will take those out, and I will end the lecture here. So, thank you all for watching, and as always, get in touch if you have any questions.